The air over the Kent coast in the early autumn of 1943 carried the smell of rain and aviation fuel. Lieutenant Alastair Ace Reed did not fit the archetype of the swaggering fighter pilot. He was quiet, meticulous, and his Spitfire Mk.V, designated Vengeance, was maintained with the precise, almost obsessive care of a concert pianist protecting his instrument. Alastair's 6 confirmed kills were the result of cold, textbook accuracy, not reckless abandon. This methodical nature earned him the nickname Ace among his squadron, a wry, backhanded compliment suggesting he lacked the fire of true, headline-making heroes. Alastair was nursing a tepid cup of tea in the dispersal hut when the klaxon shattered the afternoon peace. It was the sound every pilot both dreaded and craved, the scramble. Get airborne, get airborne. Estimated strength, 200 plus. Target confirmation, Industrial Zone B, 7-inch 200. The number hung in the air like poison gas. B-7 was the vital engine component factory, the linchpin of the war effort. If it fell, the supply chain broke. Alastair sprinted to his aircraft. The mechanics had him strapped in and engine idling in 90 seconds flats. The 317th Squadron roared off the tarmac, forming a loose V formation, heading east toward the incoming raid. The sky was clear, perfect for mass combat, but the scale of the enemy formation, a monstrous wave of Heinkel He-111 bombers escorted by dozens of agile Messerschmitt Bf-109s, was unprecedented for this sector. Bandit contact, 12 o'clock high. Engage, engage. Major Davies's voice crackled, laced with adrenaline and alarm. The engagement began instantly and violently. Alastair immediately spotted a flight of 3 Bf-109s diving on the Major's tail. He broke hard, banking Vengeance into a 7G turn. He fired a quick, controlled burst into the nearest Messerschmitt. It shuddered, its engine momentarily flaring white, before peeling away, out of the fight. But the sheer numbers overwhelmed them. In the next 60 seconds, the air became a lethal storm of cannon shells, vapor trails, and twisting metal. A Messerschmitt unexpectedly rolled out of the sun and shredded the Spitfire of Flight Lieutenant Harper. Then, Major Davies's voice cut off mid-sentence, replaced by the sound of tearing metal and static. Alastair pulled out of a spin, breathing hard. He was high above the initial melee, the sky now dotted with the dark smoke of his fallen comrades. He scanned the horizon. Below him, the main bomber stream, a glittering river of destruction, continued, largely untouched, toward B-7. He was alone. Alastair Reed, the methodical pilot with the ironic nickname, was the last Spitfire left, facing the spearhead of the largest enemy raid of the year. He checked his ammunition counter. It was high, but the clock was ticking. The fight for B-7 and his legend had just begun. Alastair dropped rapidly, cutting the silk balloon's ropes to shed the ballast bags of sand. The sudden loss of weight sent the wicker basket surging upward like a startled bird. Below, the German artillery had begun a systematic search pattern, the earth shuddering as heavy shells gouged craters into the damp ground where he had been moments before. The noise was immense, but as he rose, the chaos muted, replaced by the ominous, isolating silence of the upper atmosphere. His Vengeance was not a Spitfire, but the stripped-down, 2-man reconnaissance balloon, the Prophet, hastily repurposed for courier duty. His kills were not planes, but the critical interceptions he had to manage, avoiding enemy balloons, evading sharpshooters, and disabling the very ground stations trying to haul him down. The current mission was simple in name, impossible in execution: deliver crucial counterattack plans to the trapped forces in the distant, besieged fortress city of Metz. If the plans didn't arrive before dawn, the fortress would fall. Alastair looked across the vast, rolling terrain now spread out below him, a black-and-white landscape of mud and desperate trenches. He was alone, having launched an hour after the main military flight of 5 courier balloons had departed. He had insisted on the delay, waiting for the wind to shift, trusting his meticulous calculations over the immediate, panicked orders from the ground command. His methodical nature, the very trait that earned him the dismissive nickname Ace, was now the only thing keeping him alive. The first real threat materialized not from the ground, but from the air. High to his left, at approximately 800 feet, A German reconnaissance balloon, larger and heavily weighted with soldiers, appeared. It was anchored by thick steel cables, slowly being hauled into position to observe the main French supply lines, and, more immediately, to intercept him. Target 1, Alastair muttered, pulling out his field glasses. The enemy balloon's basket was protected by sandbags, but the main silk envelope was not. Alastair reached down to a wooden crate secured in the basket. It contained his improvised armament, small canvas bags filled with scrap metal and attached to short fuses and incendiary chemicals, a rudimentary aerial grenade. The wind was his ally. He estimated the drift, lit the fuse with his protected match, and shouted a silent command to the unseen wind gods. He threw the bag outward and upward. It looked laughably small against the vast sky. He steered the Prophet with careful adjustments of the vent rope, holding his breath as the seconds ticked past. The incendiary charge detonated 50 feet from the German balloon. It wasn't enough to pierce the envelope, but the shrapnel struck the ropes hauling the basket, shearing them instantly. With its anchor cut, the German balloon, heavier than Alastair's, began to drift helplessly back towards its own lines. Its mission failed. Alastair marked the interception in his log. 1 obstacle removed, mission integrity maintained. He hadn't shot it down, but he had effectively removed the enemy asset from the field. 1 down. But the flash of the explosion had given his position away. Down below, from the dark edge of a pine forest, came the unmistakable crack, crack, crack of repeating rifles. The sound was flat, dry, and terrifyingly close. The wind direction had betrayed him. A team of sharpshooters had been waiting. Alastair felt a sharp, heavy thwack against the wicker basket, followed by a shower of splinters. They were sighting him perfectly. He had to rise immediately, but he had shed most of his sand ballast. He glanced at the vital documents secured to his belt, the plans for Metz. He had only one way to gain altitude quickly: drop all remaining extraneous weight. But what? He grabbed the crate of remaining aerial grenades. It was heavy. Letting them go meant sacrificing his ability to defend himself against subsequent aerial threats. But the bullets were coming faster now, ripping through the bottom of the basket. He threw the crate overboard, its contents tumbling silently toward the forest below. Too exposed, he hissed, frantically pulling the vent cord to shed hydrogen, creating an aggressive downward speed, hoping to evade the narrow firing cone. He plummeted 50 feet, dodging a final, deadly volley. His stomach lurched, but the sharpshooters were silenced. He stabilized his altitude, checked his equipment, and looked at the dark forest. They knew his general direction now. The cost of escaping the sharpshooters was the loss of his only offensive weapons. He was now truly defenseless, with a long, dark flight ahead, and the shadow of the besieged city visible on the horizon. He was still alive, but his hands were empty. The worst was yet to come. Alastair guided the Prophet into the upper currents, desperate for altitude that would take him beyond the effective range of the enemy's newest rifles. The silence returned, but it was no longer the quiet of peace. It was the tense vacuum of pursuit. He was now operating at the edge of human tolerance, the air thinning, the cold biting through his thick wool greatcoat like needles. The world below, once a detailed map of mud and forest, began to blur into a single, vast expanse of monochrome gray. His log lay open in the basket, the first entry starkly visible. Target 1, reconnaissance balloon, disabled. 6 more to go. The gravity of the task, combined with his total lack of offense, pressed down on him more heavily than the atmospheric pressure. His only remaining weapon was the rope that controlled the valve, dictating his rise and fall, and the wind itself. Then, from the northeastern sector, a sound reached him that was utterly alien to the sky, a buzzing, persistent snarl, like a giant, angry hornet. Alastair brought his field glasses to his eyes. What he saw defied everything he had been taught about aerial warfare. It was not another balloon. It was a German contraption, a long, canvas-winged skeletal frame powered by a small, sputtering engine at the rear. It was a mechanized glider, capable of crude steering and, worst of all, chasing him. This was the true, terrifying face of modern war, a silent revolution taking place 700 feet above the trenches. The German device was rapidly gaining ground, its pilot evidently spotting Alastair's solitary, lumbering balloon. He estimated they were carrying 2 riflemen. They were not aiming for reconnaissance. They were aiming for a kill. Alistair knew he could not outrun it. The glider, while slow by future standards, was agile compared to the Prophet. He had to force a battle on his terms, a battle of physics, not firepower. He looked down at the documents secured to his belt, feeling the immense weight of the plans for Metz. He couldn't fail here. He began a slow, calculated descent, bleeding off hydrogen through the vent. He dropped 50 feet, then 70, watching the glider's pilot correct his course. The German pilot, confident in his machine's speed, began spiraling to position himself above Alistair, preparatory to firing down into the highly flammable hydrogen envelope. Alistair had been tracking the wind for 3 days. He knew of a notorious wind shear that typically occurred just below the 600-foot mark, where a faster, southbound current intersected with a slower, erratic eastern flow. It was a death trap for unanchored craft, but if he timed it perfectly, it might save him. He plummeted toward the invisible boundary. When his basket hit the 600-foot line, he executed a frantic, full release of the vent cord, creating momentary instability. The Prophet suddenly corkscrewed, but the glider, committed to its high-speed dive, hit the shear zone head-on. The two opposing air currents violently twisted the glider's lightweight frame. The wings buckled with a sickening, audible crack, and the small engine tore loose from its mounts, plummeting silently into the fog below. The glider, now nothing more than a broken parachute, spun away rapidly, disappearing into the dense clouds below, carrying its crew out of the fight, and, almost certainly, to their doom. Alistair stabilized the Prophet, his hands raw from the vent rope. He was gasping for air, the exertion overwhelming. He glanced at the empty space where the snarling machine had been. Target 2, mechanized interceptor, disabled. 2 down. But the desperate maneuver had cost him crucial time and altitude, pushing him dangerously close to the last known line of ground-based anti-balloon cannon, the third threat. He had removed the Hunter, but he was now flying straight into the jaws of the trap. He desperately needed a new way to gain speed and height, or the heavy artillery would make the third kill for him. The sheer speed of his plunge to evade the mechanized glider had brought Alistair dangerously low, pressing him against the lower, turbulent air currents. The price of his survival was immediate exposure. From the valley below, a colossal sound began, the methodical, heavy rhythm of the anti-balloon cannon battery that protected the main German rail line. Target 3, the artillery. They were firing a pattern of timed shells, designed not to hit the balloon directly, but to create shrapnel zones, forcing any aerial courier down through attrition. The flash of the muzzle blasts was stark white against the dark earth, followed seconds later by the terrifying, tearing sound of the shells passing too close. Alistair knew he couldn't outrun the cannon's range, which extended miles across the flat terrain. He had to cross the rail line and the battery's zone of fire within minutes, or be shredded. His only asset was the balloon itself, the highly flammable hydrogen envelope, paradoxical in its extreme vulnerability, also possessed an immense lifting capacity. He initiated an aggressive, continuous climb. He opened the valve, releasing a controlled burst of hydrogen, which stabilized his ascent. He then grabbed a thick, iron chain secured to the basket's rim, the emergency ballast chain. It was his last heavy reserve. With immense effort, he began swinging the chain in a wide arc around the basket. The plan was reckless, born of desperation. The sudden, calculated movement of the heavy chain ballast created a slight, rhythmic deviation in the balloon's vertical line. This barely perceptible wobble, combined with the natural air turbulence, played havoc with the enemy gunner's fixed calculation tables. The first shell burst high into his left, rattling the basket violently and showering the silk with dark dust. The noise was deafening, a physical blow to the eardrums. He swung the chain harder, his knuckles white against the cold iron. Crack! The second shell was terrifyingly close, exploding directly below him. The upward concussion was like a giant fist, momentarily lifting the basket and throwing Alistair against the wicker siding. He felt a sharp sting on his cheek. A piece of shrapnel had struck the side of the basket, glancing off his cheekbone. Blood bloomed instantly across his cold face. He had to take the risk. He stopped the chain's rhythmic movement and pulled the main vent cord hard, releasing a controlled, massive plume of hydrogen to create a sudden, last-second surge upward, a vertical jink. The balloon shot into the sky like a cork released underwater. The third shell burst precisely where Alistair would have been a second later, a massive, black smoke flower blooming at the expected altitude. The gunners, relying on their predictable data, had been fooled by the temporary, erratic movement. He was now clear of the immediate battery range, the cannonade fading quickly below him into a distant thudding. Alistair took a moment, leaning against the cold, damp wicker, checking the crucial documents once more. They were secure, though flecked with his blood. He marked his log. Target 3, anti-balloon cannon, evaded. Free down. He looked ahead. The sky was still the same monochrome gray, but the air felt heavier, quieter. The cost of evasion was exhaustion and injury. The relentless combat, though against different forms of assault, was taking its toll. He glanced at his instruments. The sun was now starting its slow ascent on the horizon. He was running out of darkness. More pressingly, the extensive venting of hydrogen and the shock from the near misses had left the gas envelope dangerously low. The silk was taut, but the gas was colder, less expansive. He was losing lift faster than he could compensate. The light would expose him to the next great threat: long-range enemy observers and signaling stations, waiting to direct forces toward his anticipated line of flight. And as the dawn crept closer, Alistair saw a new obstacle rising up from the fog near the besieged Metz fortress. A line of 5 anchored balloons, strategically placed to catch any remaining couriers, including the 4 balloons that had left before him. They were armed, waiting, and visible in the growing light. He was racing the sun toward a well-defended wall, and his balloon was dying. The sight of the 5 anchored German observation balloons, the Watchmen of Metz, was a stark, geometric wall against the rising sun. They were positioned in a jagged arc, designed to intercept any messenger attempting to slip over the defenses of the besieged city. Their baskets, unlike Alistair's, were heavily manned and likely bristled with carbines and signal lamps. The faint, gray light of dawn was now his enemy. The rising sun, while offering a promise of warmth, also illuminated the Prophet, turning its massive silk envelope into a clear, vulnerable target. Alistair's balloon was heavy with cold, inert hydrogen after his desperate venting. He was sinking, not fast, but irrevocably. He had to gain altitude and speed, but all his ballast was gone, and his offensive weapons lay somewhere in the dark forest miles behind him. His gaze locked onto the nearest German balloon, a large, well-defended behemoth. It was the linchpin of the defensive line, positioned highest, its anchor cables running down to a substantial ground station. If he could remove the core, the others might fall into disarray. He felt the weak, struggling pull of the gas and realized his only remaining hope was a gamble on basic thermodynamics. He exposed the dark fabric of the envelope to the first, weak rays of the sun, hoping the small temperature differential would create enough rapid thermal expansion to buy him a few dozen feet of altitude, a momentary surge of life. While waiting for the sun's physics to take hold, he emptied the basket entirely. The few remaining items, a thick woolen blanket, his emergency rations, his logbook, were jettisoned. He was left with only the wicker basket, his coat, and the precious documents secured to his waist. He then focused on the only heavy, detachable object remaining, the anchor. A length of heavy, pointed iron was currently lashed to the outside of the basket, ready to secure him to the earth once his mission was complete. The moment the sun touched the silk, Alistair felt the subtle, heartening surge. The Prophet stabilized its descent and began a slow, grudging ascent. He used this precious vertical speed to execute a near-horizontal dive, skimming dangerously close to the enemy line. As he approached the primary German balloon, he risked everything on a single, impossible throw. He unlashed the heavy iron anchor. Timing his release to coincide with a slight gust, he hurled the pointed iron downward, aiming not for the basket, but for the complex, interwoven cables securing the ground winch that held the enemy's main anchor point. The chain screamed downward, a dark streak against the morning fog. It struck the ground station with a violent clang, fouling the primary cable in a crucial pulley before snapping itself loose and falling into the trench below. The sudden, Immense strain caused the winch assembly to seize and buckle with a terrible screech of tearing metal. The main German balloon, now unmoored and uncontrolled, began to rise erratically and drift sideways into the path of its neighbor. Target 4. Command balloon anchor disabled. For down. The 4 remaining balloons reacted instantly. A flash of gunfire erupted from the nearest basket, the crack of the rifles far sharper in the thinner air. A bullet punched clean through the wicker wall just inches from Alistair's left elbow. He had to get over the wall immediately, but his hydrogen was giving out. He saw the massive envelope of his target balloon drift straight toward the cluster of the remaining 3. He had engineered a traffic jam. With the German line now in chaos, Alistair saw his chance for the 5th kill, the final, most extreme maneuver. He reached for the primary rope that connected the basket to the hydrogen envelope itself. It was a rope that should never be touched while airborne. He had to shed the drag of the heavy wicker and risk a final, controlled descent using only the envelope, like a desperate parachute. Taking a deep, painful breath, Alistair cut the main envelope rope. The basket dropped away beneath him, becoming instant scrap, leaving him suspended by a harness, clinging directly to the silk netting. He was no longer a courier. He was a desperate projectile. The sudden loss of the basket's weight sent him surging over the enemy line, escaping the torrent of fire below, but leaving him tethered precariously to a rapidly deflating, silent giant of hydrogen. Target 5, secondary anchor, chaos achieved. 5 down. But now, Alistair Reed had truly abandoned his vessel. He was hanging on for dear life, entering the final, desperate phase of his journey. Alistair hung suspended between the vast gray sky and the unforgiving earth, clinging to the cold, coarse hemp netting of the Prophet. The wicker basket, his only shelter and control station, was gone. He was a piece of debris attached to a rapidly deflating silk membrane. The silence of high altitude was replaced by the roar of the wind, which screamed past his head, making communication, even with himself, impossible. The cold was a physical agony now, seizing his fingers and burning his lungs. He looked down, his eyes tearing in the relentless wind. He was descending steadily, but the massive bulk of the hydrogen envelope, even deflated, offered enough drag to prevent a catastrophic fall, for now. His coat flapped violently, but the counterattack plans, secured inside a waterproof pouch strapped to his waist, remained safe. The chaos he had engineered in the line of the Watchman of Metz was still unfolding. The heavily manned German balloon he had unmoored with the anchor was drifting laterally, its crew desperately trying to jettison ballast to regain vertical control. Alistair, now immensely light without his basket, used the last remaining hydrogen in his envelope to execute a final, suicidal maneuver. He pulled the vent cord with every ounce of strength, releasing a massive plume of gas. This wasn't a tactical move to rise, but to accelerate his descent rapidly and deliberately into the path of the drifting German balloon. The sudden drop allowed the Prophet to surge forward horizontally, driven by the wind's momentum. Alistair watched, heart hammering, as the dark, uncontrolled enemy balloon drifted directly across his sight line. The trailing ropes and torn edges of the unmoored German balloon snagged the netting of one of the remaining watchmen, a heavily armed observation platform positioned lower than the others. The impact was soft, but the resulting entanglement was final. The weight of the 2 balloons, fighting the anchor cable of the 3rd, caused the cable to stretch taut, then fray, and finally snap with the sound of a pistol shot. The 2 entangled balloons surged upward, spinning away from the defensive line, their mission rendered impossible. Alistair marked the log in his head, target 6. Observation platform, disabled by entanglement. 6 down. One more target remained for the day's impossible tally, though he did not yet know what it would be. The success was immediate, but so was the cost. The rapid loss of gas had brought him down to approximately 200 feet, placing him well within the deadly effective range of the final German defenses, the sharpshooters defending the outer moat of the Metz fortress. Below, he could now see the individual figures of the soldiers, dark silhouettes against the fortifications, leveling their rifles. They were waiting for his final, helpless drop. He had minutes, perhaps seconds, of control left before the balloon became merely a heavy cloth parachute. He looked at the terrain, He needed to drift 50 more yards to clear the final line of wire and drop into the forested buffer zone near the French perimeter. 50 yards meant 50 seconds of controlled flight. He knew what he had to do. He had eliminated the aerial threat and neutralized the heavy artillery. The final threat was distance, and the final obstacle was weight. The pouch containing the crucial counterattack plans for Metz was secured to his belt. This document, the entire purpose of his journey, now represented the last remaining weight of consequence, a few pounds of paper and leather. If he dropped the documents, he might lighten the load enough for the dying hydrogen to hold him aloft for those precious 50 yards. If he held them, the balloon would settle immediately, dropping him directly into the firing line. He couldn't drop the plans. The mission was the document. Alistair reached instead for the thick, wool coat that had kept him from freezing to death. It weighed perhaps 4 pounds, but it was 4 pounds of life he was shedding. With numb fingers, he unclasped the heavy brass buttons and let the coat fall away into the gray mist, offering a final, desperate sacrifice to the air. The momentary lightness gave him a barely perceptible surge, just enough to carry him forward. But as the coat vanished below, a final, chilling observation struck him. He saw a small, dark shape rising rapidly from a concealed, forward trench, a seventh, small, single-manned aerial machine, designed not for observation, but for interception at low altitude. The forgotten ace had cleared the wall, only to find the ultimate hunter waiting in the moat. The small, dark shape rising from the forward trench was a horrifying sight. It was a Drachenflieger, a motorized kite, built for silent, close-quarters interception. This final German asset was operated by a single pilot and carried a large, powerful harpoon gun designed to puncture and ignite the hydrogen envelope of descending balloons. It was slow, unstable, and at this low altitude, lethally effective against a target that had already shed its skin. The pilot, clearly an expert sharpshooter, brought the kite level with Alistair, keeping his own height deliberately below the belly of the Prophet. He was holding his position 50 feet away, waiting for the balloon to sink just enough to give him a clear, upward shot into the hydrogen-filled dome. Alistair was hanging almost motionless, his body chilled to the core, his hands raw from gripping the netting. He was barely 30 feet above the barbed wire and the moat, with the forested safety of the French perimeter just 40 yards ahead. The weight of the plans and his waterlogged boots, the only weight remaining, was dragging him down rapidly. He was the definition of an exposed target. He stared across the narrow gap at the German pilot, who was protected by a thick, dark leather tunic and a heavy helmet, his face a shadowed mask of concentration. This was not an engagement against machinery or artillery. This was a personal duel, black and white, in its brutal simplicity. Alistair knew the Drachenflieger's weakness, its stability. The small, sputtering engine was barely enough to propel the canvas wings, and its flight path was highly dependent on constant, subtle shifts of the pilot's weight. Any sudden, disruptive movement would send it tumbling. He needed to create that movement. He released his grip on the main harness netting with his right hand and, using the last of his energy, began swinging his body violently, initiating a wide, uncontrolled pendulum motion beneath the balloon. The German pilot, startled by the erratic lateral movement, jerked his kite to compensate. The Drachenflieger's rudder was slow to respond. The harpoon gun, designed for accuracy, required a stable platform. Alistair's deliberate destabilization bought him precious milliseconds. As Alistair swung wide, he reached for the only remaining structural piece of the Prophet, the thick, heavy rope that led from his harness up to the central attachment point of the netting. He took out the clasp knife he kept lashed to his thigh. This rope was his last tether to the balloon, and cutting it meant entering a freefall. He waited for his body's arc to bring him closest to the Drachenflieger. Just as the German pilot finally lined up his harpoon, Alistair made his final, calculated cut. The heavy rope parted with a sudden, dull snap. The consequence was immediate and dual. 1. Alistair plummeted. 2. The sudden, violent upward recoil of the released rope and netting, now freed of his weight, whipped the dying hydrogen envelope with tremendous force. The hydrogen-filled silk balloon, no longer weighted by Alistair, shot upward and forward like a deflated bladder. The huge, sudden bulk of the balloon's underside struck the delicate, canvas wings of the Drachenflieger mid-flight. There was no fire, only the sound of splintering wood and tearing fabric. The German kite, its wings annihilated by the immense, flapping drag of the silk, immediately flipped over and plummeted into the mud of the forward moat, its harpoon firing uselessly into the sky. Alistair, meanwhile, was in freefall. He had cut the rope to avoid the harpoon, but now he was falling directly toward the moat and the waiting rifles of the sharpshooters. He was perhaps 40 feet up, dropping too fast. He scrabbled wildly for the vent rope, which, by a miracle of entanglement, was still wrapped around his wrist. As he fell, he tugged the cord with all his strength, pulling a final, massive tear in the silk above him, transforming the balloon from a falling object into a crude, emergency parachute. The drag deployed instantly, stopping his catastrophic drop and turning his fall into a violent, wind-whipped descent. He hit the earth with a jarring, brutal impact, sinking instantly into the cold, deep mud just yards short of the moat's edge. He marked the last one, target 7, Drachenflieger, destroyed by impact. 7 down. He had achieved the impossible tally, but he was alive, trapped in the mud, and completely exposed. The sound of running boots and shouted German commands reached him through the ringing in his ears. He clawed desperately at the thick, clinging mud, the documents still secured to his waist. He had reached the ground, but he had not reached safety. The mission was not over. It was about to become an infantry war. Alistair's body was a single, agonizing ache, submerged in the freezing, thick mud that clung to him like lead weights. The silence of the upper atmosphere was brutally replaced by the immediate, overwhelming noise of war, the pounding of his own heart, the rhythmic thump-thump of boots running through the trenches, and the furious, guttural German shouts. He reacted instinctively, pulling the enormous, tattered mass of the hydrogen envelope down over his head and shoulders. The silk, now nothing more than wet cloth, offered no protection from bullets, but provided the precious camouflage of debris. He lay still, tasting the sharp, metallic tang of his own blood mixing with the cold earth. The running stopped just yards away, at the edge of the final German line. Alistair could hear the labored breathing and the rattle of rifle bolts being pulled back. He risked a slow, agonizing turn of his head. He saw them, 3 infantrymen, their faces grim and triumphant, separated from him by a treacherous, wide span of the defensive moat, filled with stagnant water and snaking barbed wire. The moat was not easily crossed, but they were sighting their rifles, prepared to fire into the silk mass until any movement ceased. The realization hit him with the chilling clarity of the near-death experience. He was not going to walk the remaining distance. His legs were numb, his hands were useless claws, and the distance to the French wire was still 30 yards across clear, open ground. He had conquered the sky, but the mud was his tomb. The mission was complete only when the documents were inside the fortress. The waterproof pouch, secured by his belt, was still intact. He gently pulled it free, feeling the crinkle of the vital maps and scribbled intelligence within. He had to turn the message itself into a projectile, a final, unguided missile. He looked around desperately for something he could use for weight and distance. All ballast was gone. His coat was gone. He looked down at his feet, buried deep in the mud. He used his clasp knife to slash the leather straps of his 2 waterlogged, heavy boots. They were the final pieces of extraneous weight, saturated and useless for walking, but perfect for throwing. Working frantically beneath the cover of the silk, he pulled the knife, then the boots, free of the mud. The leather was thick, heavy, and stiff with cold. He cut away the heavy, steel eyelets and laces, creating strong, short lengths of cord. He wrapped the priceless document pouch tightly in the thick, wet leather of one boot, securing it with the laces and his belt buckle. The resulting projectile was dense and aerodynamic, a deadly lump of necessity. He had one chance. The German soldiers, growing impatient with the lack of movement beneath the silk, began firing sporadic, testing shots. One round ripped through the fabric above his head, spitting earth into his eyes. Alistair pushed himself up, pulling free of the clinging mud with a primal grunt. He stood, a scarecrow figure caked entirely in black mud and draped in shredded white silk, a momentary, terrifying silhouette against the weak dawn. He ignored the shouts and the sudden increase in rifle fire. All his focus, all his methodical, deadly calculation was concentrated into his right arm. He wound the boot-wrapped plan's back, the weight feeling enormous in his numb hand. He aimed not at the fortress wall itself, but at the small, high-observation hatch he knew the French used for forward signaling. With a final, desperate cry, a sound more animal than human, he hurled the projectile toward the distant, gray stone. It flew true, a dark, heavy streak cutting across the final 100 yards of no man's land. The moment the documents left his hand, the German soldiers broke cover, scrambling across the wire and into the moat, realizing the objective had been jettisoned. Alastair, empty-handed, had achieved the 7 kills and the final delivery, but he was left standing alone, defenseless, in the heart of the enemy's grasp. The plans were safe, but the ace was about to be captured. The German soldiers were upon him, shouting in harsh, triumphant relief. The 3 infantrymen, crossing the moat's narrowest point, converged on Alastair, their rifles pointed at his chest. He stood motionless in the black mud, an exhausted, silent pillar of defeat, his arms raised in a gesture of surrender. The mission was complete. The documents were hurled towards Metz, but the man, the ace, was forfeit. One of the soldiers, a young corporal with a pale, fierce face, jabbed his bayonet roughly at Alastair's ribs, ordering him to move toward the forward trench line. The black and white clarity of the situation was absolute: capture, interrogation, imprisonment. As the corporal moved to bind Alastair's wrists, a sudden, sharp command cut through the morning air, spoken in flawless French. "Leave him." All 4 men, Alastair and the 3 German soldiers, froze. The voice was authoritative, bearing the weight of command, and it came from the thick, smoke-shrouded wreckage of the moat. From the crumpled canvas and broken wood of the fallen Drachenflieger emerged the pilot Alastair had disabled moments earlier. He was covered in mud and oil, his helmet lost, but he was alive, holding a fractured arm to his side. He was not a junior officer, but a captain, his insignia barely visible beneath the grime. He dismissed the infantrymen with a terse wave, and they reluctantly backed away, confused but obedient. The German captain approached Alastair, stopping just outside the range of the mud that coated the pilot. "You are the last of them, yes?" the captain asked, switching to a surprisingly casual, academic English. "The one who delayed? The one they call the ace?" Alastair merely nodded, breathing heavily. "I am Captain Klaus Richter. You destroyed my craft. That is an expected consequence of war." Richter paused, his eyes scanning the surrounding battlefield, the wreckage of the mechanized glider, the tattered remains of Alastair's balloon, the distant, silent artillery lines. "But you did something unexpected. When you cut your rope, you didn't just escape. You saved my life." Alastair looked blankly at the German officer. "The trajectory of my fall," Richter explained, gesturing to the ruins of his kite, "was straight into the wire. Your balloon, released of its weight, deflected my machine just enough to throw me into the deep mud rather than the stakes. I am broken, Lieutenant, but I am not dead. I owe you a debt." This was the twist. The pilot of the 7th kill, the one who was supposed to ensure Alastair's capture, was instead indebted to him. Alastair's final, desperate act of self-preservation had, unintentionally, created a moral complication for the enemy. The theme of storytelling was now paramount. Richter was choosing to write a different ending to this single, brutal chapter. Richter glanced quickly at the infantrymen, who were still watching. He lowered his voice. "I saw your throw. Did it reach the wall?" Alastair stared back, his expression unreadable. "Do not insult me, Lieutenant. I do not ask for its contents. I ask only for the satisfaction of knowing if your sacrifice, and mine, was worth the price. Did the package reach the fortress?" Alastair gave a fractional nod. Richter nodded back, a flicker of professional respect passing over his grim features. "Good. Then you have done your duty. Now, I shall do mine." He raised his voice, shouting a command to the waiting infantrymen, but not in French or English. He spoke in a rapid, official German, pointing at the wreckage of the glider and then toward the German trenches. "This area is secure. The pilot perished in the fall, and his balloon is destroyed. Haul the remains back to the lines. It is an engineering priority." The infantrymen, Hearing the commanding officer confirm the death of the courier immediately turned their attention to the mechanical priority, the Drachenflieger wreckage, and began the laborious task of untangling it from the mud. They had seen the fall, and the captain's word was law. Alastair Reed, the forgotten ace, was standing 5 yards from the enemy, but officially, he was dead. Richter had just purchased him a 30-second window of non-existence. You have 30 seconds of official death, Lieutenant. Choose your direction wisely. Richter turned his back, supervising the hauling of his ruined kite. Alastair did not hesitate. He had the documents delivered, and he was being given an escape route, a final, miraculous extension of the mission. He turned and began to crawl, silent and low, toward the French wire, leaving his muddy uniform, his blood, and the identity of the ace behind him. The greatest danger was still the enemy within the fortress itself, the suspicion and scrutiny that awaited a man who was officially dead. Alastair crawled, silent and low, across the final meters of earth, driven purely by the fear that Captain Richter would revoke his momentary reprieve. He passed the last stretch of rusty wire and tumbled, exhausted and unconscious, into the welcoming, muddy safety of the French forward position. He awoke hours later in a field hospital within the besieged Metz fortress. The atmosphere was one of strained, exhausted relief. The counterattack plans he had delivered were successful. The fortress held, the offensive was underway, and the German advance had been blunted by the timely intervention of the outside forces now moving to break the siege. Alastair was immediately subjected to intense scrutiny. He was not greeted as a hero, but as a potential liability. He was the only one of the 5 couriers to have made it through, and he was the only one not reported as captured or killed. The intelligence officers, gaunt men with eyes too old for their faces, saw not the 7 eliminated targets, but the improbable story of the German captain. You were captured, Lieutenant Reed. Your death was confirmed by German signals traffic, stated Colonel Dubois, lighting a cigarette with a shaking hand. Yet, here you are. You claim a German captain, a man named Richter, let you walk free after you disabled his machine. 1. Alastair recounted the duel with the Drachenflieger and the debt of survival. He spoke of the disabled balloons, the evaded artillery, and the neutralized mechanized glider. He detailed every kill, the methodical pilot describing the mechanics of his impossible day. Dubois listened, his face impassive. 7 kills, Lieutenant? 1 man, on 1 flight, with no weapons, against balloons, artillery, and a motorized kite? This is a story for the common soldiers, not for a report, Reed. The military machine needed heroes who fit a clear narrative, men who fought until the end, who were retrieved by their own side, and whose victories were undeniable. Alastair's victory was messy, based on a single act of moral ambiguity, and tainted by his temporary death in enemy lines. Furthermore, acknowledging his feat meant admitting that 5 other, more conventional couriers had failed where the ace had succeeded through unconventional, almost reckless, ingenuity. The colonel nodded slowly, stubbing out his cigarette. The mission succeeded. The documents were vital, and for that, you will be commended. But your story, it is complicated. It is not suitable for the record. The official story was written quickly. The French courier balloon, the Prophet, was destroyed by enemy fire. The pilot, Lieutenant Alastair Reed, was officially listed as killed in action, thereby confusing the enemy as to the status of the delivery. The documents were later recovered in the forward area, having fallen from the aircraft. The 7 fate accomplished the 6 disabled enemy assets, and the successful delivery of the plans were quietly absorbed into the broader success of the Metz relief effort, attributed to superior French planning and conventional artillery fire. The 7 acts of individual heroism were erased, becoming part of the collective success. Alastair was given a minor decoration for courage under fire, transferred to a distant, quiet administrative post, and told to never discuss the details of that day. He never protested. His duty was the mission, not the recognition. The plans were delivered, and Metz was saved. Decades later, an academic researching the logistics of the Franco-Prussian War stumbled upon a fragmented German field report detailing the sudden, inexplicable loss of 7 key aerial assets on the morning of the Metz relief. The report, penned by a Captain Klaus Richter, mentioned a mysterious, singular ghost balloon that executed maneuvers defying all known science before being officially destroyed. The scholar found a similar, conflicting French archive entry, the simple listing of a Lieutenant Alastair Reed, recorded as Kia but later noted for a minor commendation. The two pieces of paper, the German acknowledgement of the 7 losses and the French notation of the dead pilot, never connected in any public history. Alastair Reed, the methodical pilot who had stared down the impossible and shot down 7 targets in a single, chaotic morning, lived out his days quietly, forever known only by the dismissive nickname from his youth. He remained the forgotten ace, his incredible story buried in the black mud of the Metz moat, a testament to the idea that in war, the greatest heroes are often those whose victories are too inconvenient to be officially told.